Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this second online event organized by the Aberdeen Italian Circle. The Aberdeen Italian Circle is a branch of the Società Dante Alighieri, which is a society based in Rome that promotes Italian language and culture around the world. So welcome also to all our friends from the various Dante groups in the UK, in Italy, and beyond. Tonight we are meeting with Dr. Joanne Anderson. Joanne is a reader in History of Art and head of discipline at the University of Aberdeen. Joanne previously held posts at the Warburg Institute in London, at Birkbeck College, also in London, at the University of Sussex and at the University of Warwick. So for Joanne, is coming back to her alma mater because she graduated with her undergraduate degree at the University of Aberdeen. And then she went on to acquire a master from the Courtauld Institute of Art and a PhD from Warwick University. Tonight, she's going to present Divine Ascent, that is part of the wider research for this book, Moving with the Magdalen, that was published by Bloomsbury, and you can purchase online by looking at the website of Bloomsbury Publishing and also the major book retailers and Amazon. So I'm very much looking forward to your talk, Joanne. I will just ask everyone to mute their microphones and possibly also your cameras. And I'm asking you to do so because cameras tend to pick up even the slightest movement and change focus from the speaker to the audience. And in asking you to do so, I would like to thank David Dreyer, who is looking after the IT aspect of our event and is also the secretary of our circle. Thank you, David, for helping us. And I think that we can let Joanne share her screen with us. There will be an opportunity after the talk to ask Joanne some questions. Thank you, Joanne.
Okay, thank you, Sandra. Just PowerPoint. There we go. Hopefully that's working okay. Can you see that okay, Sandra?
It is. It's wonderful. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay. All right, I'm just going to minimize down to not see anyone at the moment. Okay, well, thank you, Sandra, for that very kind introduction, and to both you and David for the invitation to speak tonight, and also to all of you in the audience for attending this evening on Zoom. It's a great pleasure to be with you all. It's an absolute delight and honour to be speaking to the Aberdeen Italian Society, but also a matter of small amusement to be speaking about art and religion in the late medieval Alps. Dante was none too complimentary about the mountain range in his De Vulgari Eloquentia. Indeed, as you can see from this quote, it's the linguistic impurity about the mount that he identifies in this geography that is part of the chaff that he needs to sieve away to refine the purest vernaculars, with the Tuscan obviously reigning supreme. So in a nutshell, the lithic arc of the Alps constitutes the limits of his Italian nation. We're on slightly safer ground, allegorically speaking, in Dante's Divine Comedy, where purgatory is a mountain up which souls must climb the 7 terraces in order to reach the summit of earthly paradise, as illustrated here in Domenico de Michelino's painting of the subject in the Florence Cathedral. Dante must make an ascent to the state of innocence that existed before Adam and Eve fell from grace, thus reaching what we might call base camp for the way to paradise. And you can see Adam and Eve just standing there in the Garden of Eden at the top of the mountain. Now, Dante's 2 works provide a helpful, if perhaps unexpected, framework for my book on Mary Magdalene, Art and Devotional Practices in the Alps during the later Middle Ages. De Vulgari Eloquentia draws attention to the cultural diversity of the Alps, not necessarily a melting pot, but rather a place with multiple local identities, dialects, and traditions abutting one another from valley to valley, region to region, often defying modern national boundaries. Equally, it reminds us that during this historical period, the mountains were places of residence, activity, and exchange, be that commercial, artistic, or intellectual, as much as they were a fierce barrier to cross, particularly during inclement weather. Now, Purgatorio takes us to the notion of divine ascent, which is highly apt to Mary Magdalene. In her apocryphal life or hagiography, it is said that Mary Magdalene retreated to the wilderness to do penance for her sins for 30 years. As you can see here in the two images that I'm showing you on the right-hand side, one of the works from my research. Every day she was raised to heaven 7 times according to the canonical hours, so that she might be sustained by angelic singing in lieu of actual food and drink. And as a result, her hair grows so long it covers her entire body, hence the hairy onesuit. In medieval times, in both pilgrimage contexts and the visual arts, this wilderness was equated often with mountains. To ascend the mountain was to ascend toward the divine, a trope that finds its roots in antiquity, is repeated in the poetry and texts of Petrarch, and perpetuated throughout the early modern and modern eras through the language of human experience and the sublime. So it's not surprising that Mary Magdalene's cult held sway in the mountains from the late 13th century onwards. Firstly, it was close to the main pilgrimage sites for Mary Magdalene in France, namely Saint-Maximin in Provence for the relics, and the grotto at La Sainte-Baume, for where she was reputed to have spent her lengthy penance, and where there is still a sanctuary for pilgrims to visit. And in this slide here, you can see the Massif in Provence that is referred to, that has the sanctuary still today. And in the painting to the left from the National Gallery, the Massif beyond the aperture in the architecture, you can see there a fairly faithful rendition of the complex that the pilgrims would have experienced in the landscape. Secondly, and most importantly, the very terrain of the mountains and the route through it allowed both parishioners and pilgrims to simulate the experience of the primary cult location in France for the Magdalene through the specific sightings of churches in the landscape dedicated to the saint, and through art, the artworks that graced their walls and altars. In this way, and as I argue in my book, Mary Magdalene's success in the Alps is due to her universal and international appeal, but also because of the strategies employed by local communities to make the Magdalene their own through the visual arts. The local is embedded in the universal. Now, my book takes a case study approach to the topic, with each chapter exploring a different theme or context that argues for a relationship between image, faith, and place. All 7 chapters work within the twin frameworks of pilgrimage and parish in order to evidence the meeting of the local and the universal. So on this art historical journey across the Alps, the first of its kind, from around 1290 to 1510, and these are the dates of the earliest and latest artwork I account for, I account for the body politics of the saint in the wake of the shift of the relics of Mary Magdalene from Burgundy to Provence, the attempts of a religious order, the Premonstratensian canons, to leverage the imagery of the saint as part of pastoral care in the parishes in the Swiss Cuisance. I look at the tussle between the Dominican order and a local parish church for the control of the saint's local cult in South Tyrol, but also how it intersects with the cult of St. James, and in this way how it connects the local Magdalene pilgrimage networks to those in France, but also to those at Santiago de Compostela in Spain. The enshrinement of the Magdalene's cult is also looked at in relation to a local bleeding host miracle in Tyrol. I also look at the cult's adoption by miners in the Tyrol and the production of 2 splendid altar pieces that really mine the iconography of the Magdalene. I'm also been interested in my book to investigate the role of migrant workshops in the Alps, who are responsible for the transmission of the saint's imagery. And there I look particularly at the Italian Prealps and its transmission from Lombardy across to the Prealps of Trentino Alto Adige. And finally, the insertion of Mary Magdalene into the phenomenon of resurrection shrines for unbaptized babies in the Swiss Grisons, how Mary Magdalene becomes an advocate for these lost souls. All of this I do through the analysis of churches, chapels and shrines, wall paintings, stained glass and altarpieces. So that's the kind of broad overview of what my book is concerned with. But for the remainder of my time speaking to you tonight, I'm going to be talking about the cover image of the book. So again, thank you, Sandra, for holding up the actual object in the introduction. And here it is in this particular slide. So it seems most apt that I speak about that one tonight. So that's the first reason why I'm focusing on it. It is also a singular object, making it far easier for us to concentrate on rather than trying to rove across a 30 scenes long fresco cycle in rather challenging condition. But a third reason why I've been most interested to talk about this altarpiece is the fact that up until now, it's never been inserted into a sustained investigation in Mary Magdalene narratives. So thus it poses particular opportunities to me for including a work of art that's not really been discussed in relation to the study of Mary Magdalene, but also it posed a number of significant challenges about how to narrate that successfully. So this is very much a hypothesis that I was putting forward in the book, but what I feel it does is speak most fundamentally to that interaction of image, faith and place along late medieval roots that is at the core of my book. So I'm going to now sort of shift register in a way to plunge you into the historic detail of this altarpiece. Right. So on the 3rd of April, 1295, Pope Boniface VIII ratified the relics of Mary Magdalene held at the Dominican convent of St. Maximin in Provence. That's the original cult site, or the second major cult site of Mary Magdalene in France. This was nearly 20 years after Charles of Salerno, member of the Angevin ruling dynasty of the Kingdom of Naples, and soon ruler of that kingdom, had rediscovered the body of the saint in her sculpted tomb in Provence, in what has long been recognized by scholars as an example of holy theft. In doing so, Charles challenged the authority of the Benedictine monks of Vézelay Abbey in Burgundy, who for over 200 years had claimed possession of the Magdalene's relics as legitimized by successive popes. It was a canny maneuver for the body of one of Christianity's most important saints for political gain, but it also overturned the pilgrimage practices of hundreds, if not thousands, of people across Europe who travelled far and wide to venerate the relics at Vézelay in the hope of the remission of sins, of bodily cures, for personal devotion and for protection. After the retranslation of the Magdalene's relics in 1279, and certainly by 1295, such pious practices were becoming reorientated towards Provence and its key sites, namely the church with its crypt, which held the tomb of Mary Magdalene and her companions, as well as the grotto on the nearby Massif, a place visited during the Vézalian years of pilgrimage, and thus representing a measure of continuity between the two cult sites. There was a new guardian order, namely the Dominicans, and a redisplay of the relics to accompany the modified cult story and its new attendant miracles. Such a change in circumstances reinvigorated the cult in its international appeal, with a series of artworks codifying the shift in the second half of the 13th century. These were to be found in Florence, Assisi, and in a village in Western Alps. So here's our focus this evening is on this late 13th century sculpted altarpiece from the Aosta Valley near Turin, which I believe responds to the body politics of Mary Magdalene in a most material way. I've situated it within a series of influential occurrences. The first being the compilation and circulation of Jacobus de Voragines' Golden Legend from the 1260s, the retranslation of the Magdalene's relics in 1279, and their papal approbation in 1295. I've also proposed the influence of the formal qualities of some late Roman sarcophagi in the crypt of St. Maximin, in conjunction with more contemporary types of relic containers on the altarpiece. So the sculpted altarpiece was donated to the Museo Civico d'Arte Antica in the Palazzo Madama Turin in 1867. The original entry record of the museum notes that the large composite panel, dated to around 1295, is from the village of Carema, located at the southern mouth of the Aosta Valley. A more precise provenance for the altarpiece is unknown due to a lack of documentary records prior to its entry to the collection. To make matters more complicated, the parish church of Carema has not always borne a dedication to St. Martin, and no Magdalene chapels exist in or around the village. So what makes this artwork evidence of late medieval pilgrimage as linked to the cult of Mary Magdalene other than her subject matter? In medieval times, Carema was a small but strategically placed toll point on an important pilgrimage route in Europe, the Via Francigena. This route ran between Canterbury and Rome, with branches that connected it to other important sacred destinations, including Santiago de Compostela and the cult of St. James. One of these branches passed through Switzerland, so crossing the Alps, and entered Italy through the Aosta Valley, with Carema a potential stopping point. The village fell under the feudal rule of the Bailesi family, but also served the buying lords of nearby Pont San Martin and Costruzione, whose bridges channeled merchant and other profitable footfall for the easy collection of taxes in this mountainous terrain. At such points of convergence, local communities were sustained by contact with a wider world. This included pilgrims traveling to cult sites to see precious relics and experience places of contemplation, which might lie beyond the mountains in southern France or closer by, like the Sacromonte of Biella near Vercelli, which is indicated in the map on the left-hand side. As such, Carema was a prime location to engage with the cult of Mary Magdalene, being relatively proximate to Provence. This was achieved by the commissioning, production, and prominent display of a high-quality altarpiece. Okay, and this is Carema here at the mouth of the valley. The main corpus of the altarpiece is comprised of two horizontal planks of wood measuring around 205 centimeters in length and 143 centimeters in height. It is sculpted entirely from Swiss pine and retains much of its original polychrome throughout, with some small traces of gilding. 4 iron bolts at the outer extremities suggest that the wing panels were once attached, substantially extending the structure and its decorative potential. These wings would have also closed around the central panel, making the altarpiece a container whose sacred content was revealed on appropriate feast days. Each painted figure, decorative feature, and architectural framework of the altarpiece is individually carved and attached by glue and nails, including the miniature liturgical and dining apparatus in the respective scenes. Looking at the altarpiece obliquely, the dramatic cast of figures and their settings project outward from the support. It creates a highly texturized surface with a depth of field enhanced by pockets of shadow and revelations in light, provided by candles or lamps. Such enlivened materiality both impels and sustains close contemplation of each episode and its bold configuration. The sacred story is organized from left to right and then right to left along the horizontal registers, and it begins at the bottom left-hand corner. The first scene is the anointing in the house of the Pharisee, where the saint can be seen crawling under the table to weep over, dry, and anoint Christ's feet. It is followed by Mary Magdalene as Mirror 4, in which there is a shift from horizontal to vertical positioning, a bodily rhetoric that declares her change in status from sinner to saint, as confirmed by the presence of her halo. Next are the 3 Marys, Magdalene, Salome, and Cleophas, arriving at Christ's open tomb to anoint his body as 2 soldiers sleep by its side. The lower register of the altarpiece is completed by the scene of Christ's appearance to Mary Magdalene in the garden, a scene of the Noli Me Tangere, which is very close in design to pilgrimage badges of the period, particularly in the placement of the tree, as making that physical barrier between the Magdalene and Christ. The story continues with the Magdalene's self-imposed exile in the wilderness. And we can see her here in her rocky cave, again evoking that mountain landscape. So we're now moved up into the upper register of the altarpiece, and we're at the right-hand side of it, and we're going to move left across the visual field. The next scene, in which was the title slide of my talk tonight, a detail of her praying hands as she ascends into upwards into contact with the angels who are going to sing to her. We can see here the hirsute saint being lifted by a pair of tumbling angels, that divine ascent. And such a celestial experience is conveyed by the absence of any earthly setting, but also by means of a contrast with her cave-dwelling existence in the previous scene. The large central compartment under the main gable presents Mary Magdalene kneeling at an altar to receive her last communion. And this is in the last year of her life, so at the end of her self-imposed penitence in the wilderness, that she comes back into the fold of the church in order to receive her last communion and her funeral. A close-up detail here just gives you a sense of the detail and the delicacy of the carving of this altarpiece, and where we can see an individually carved Eucharistic wafers being presented to the saint's mouth by the bishop. And this is Saint Maximin, her fellow exile from Judea, as recounted in the Golden Legend. So for an altarpiece that's going to be most likely sitting within a church in this parish, the visible presence here of a bishop in the central panel, giving the host to the penitent saint, the kneeling saint here, is most important. Moving left to the final compartment, we encounter the death of Mary Magdalene. Her body, clad in thick waves of hair, lies prostrate at the base of the dividing column, almost like a tree of Jesse, this formation, with delicately carved wrists neatly crossed. Two angels in the upper left section carry the Magdalene's soul in a cloth of honor up to heaven. We thus end with the body of the saint on display after a series of scenes that cover the key themes of penitence, redemption, revelation, vision, authentication, and sanctity. The microarchitecture of the altarpiece provides a sense of structure and rhythm. A small shrine-like edifice occupies the space between every arch, while the truncated columns are decorated with foliated capitals, and the ribbon cornicing that separates the two registers is adorned with evenly placed roundels bearing decorative patterns. Colour also plays a harmonizing role in the visibly busy surface of this altarpiece. It is rhythmic in its organization and highlighted by filigree work in white. In its original state, then, the altarpiece would have been a sumptuous-looking object, remarkable for its in-depth of carving and its high level of finishing, equally with its full resplendent gilding that would have pointed away from its more base materials of manufacture. The altarpiece is attributed to the Europa master and his workshop, a group of artisans active throughout Piedmont and the Aosta Valley up until the 1330s. Prior to his work in Carema, the master worked on his first big commission at the sanctuary in Biella, near Vercelli, from where he takes his name, his associated name. And this is a pilgrimage site in the neighboring valley, which would eventually become a sacromonte, or sacred mountain, simulating pilgrimage to the Holy Land. So the artist was used to traveling for work and being engaged for prestigious commissions that were linked to the cult of relics, telling us not only about the business practice of artisans and the economics of demand, but also about style standards and expectations for sacred types. Now, according to the New Propaganda of 1279, Mary Magdalene's relics, if we remember, had found their final resting place in a late 4th century Roman sarcophagus in the Hypogeum, or the underground tomb below the Church of St. Maximin in Provence, so in the crypt of the basilica. This Roman funerary site becomes the crypt of the new Dominican Basilica of St. Maximin, begun in 1295, as part of the enshrinement process instigated by the transfer of cult and change of spiritual guard. The tomb was one of 4 marble containers appropriated for late medieval Christian purposes, none of which bore imagery directly related to the saint or her companions, being Maximin, Marcellus, and Sidonius. Lazarus and Martha, the siblings of Mary Magdalene, were buried elsewhere in the region. The Magdalen, so-called Magdalen column or sarcophagus actually displays passion and martyr iconography, including a crux invicta in the central niche, so nothing to do with the Magdalen stories. But such details were seemingly unimportant to the medieval pilgrims seeking contact with an archaic reliquary. The 4 tombs were of crucial importance to the new pilgrimage site as authentic objects and were to be displayed accordingly. After all, they predated the first holy theft of the relics from Provence to Vézelay Abbey, strengthening the case of the Angevins. Charles was quick to display the Magdalene relics publicly and in opulent reliquaries. Nevertheless, as the original containers of the ritualized remains of the saints that conform to structural and compositional typologies, I've argued in my book that in addition to being objects of devotion, the tombs also shaped ideas about how the Magdalene was to be imaged in the immediate aftermath of the Angevin coup. Unfortunately, no late medieval paintings and sculptures survived from Saint-Maximin in Provence to explore the influence of the tombs discovered in 1279, so-called rediscovered. Instead, we can look further afield to works such as the Magdalene Master's tall gable panel of 1280 and the fresco cycle in the lower church of the Franciscan Basilica in Assisi, produced by Giotto's workshop in around 1320s. So I'm just going to skip over here. This is the Basilica of Saint-Maximin. And here's the Magdalene Master's panel. It was produced in the immediate aftermath of Charles of Salerno's holy theft of the body of Mary Magdalene. It presents the hirsute saint surrounded by 8 scenes of her life that correspond to the Golden Legend. Significantly, it concludes in the lower right corner with her funeral, where we can see the intact corpse lying in a stridulated sarcophagus, much like the prostrate figure in the Carema altarpiece. Stridulation was a visual shorthand for the antiquity of the legend. But the tomb and its decoration also point to the archaeological record in southern France, to the tombs that purportedly once contained the sacred relics. The 7-scene fresco cycle displayed across the 3 walls of Bishop Pontano's funerary chapel in the lower church of Assisi substantiates this kind of indexicality, about this linking of objects to an original cult site. The cycle concludes the first ever depiction of a fertility miracle that belongs to the apocryphal legend of Mary Magdalene during her time in Gaul. It is recounted that Mary Magdalene ensured that the local governor of Provence and his wife could have a baby in return for their conversion to Christianity. This process involved a pilgrimage to Rome and Jerusalem, during which time the princess and baby were left on a rocky outcrop. The wife died during childbirth, and the baby boy was left to perish, as the pilgrims would not be able to carry on their journey. The miracle being is that when the prince actually comes back, the governor comes back from his pilgrimage is to Rome and Jerusalem, he passes the island and finds that his child is still alive, yet a number of years older, and that when he beseeches Mary Magdalene of why she did not save his wife as well as his son, and makes the case for his pilgrimage and his faith, Mary Magdalene restores her to life, and they are able to travel back en famille. So it's all a happy ending in that case, thus demonstrating the power of intercession that the saint has. So in this scene here, the lunette of the west wall in the Assisi chapel brings together 2 pilgrimages in one scene. The journey of Mary Magdalene in the background in the boat, and her fellow Christians to Gaul in a rudderless boat, and that's part of their martyrdom. And secondly, the Prince of Marseille, who discovers on the voyage home from his pilgrimage that his son has survived years of abandonment and now presented as a rocky island at the breast of his dead mother, who in the legend will wake up soon at his bequest. We see her lying on her side towards the viewer, enclosed in a voluminous robe, much like the sculptural effigy of a tomb monument. And so these 2 tests of faith that are illustrated in the painting, miraculous interventions and the promise of resurrection, are set above a side entrance to the Magdalen Chapel, alongside a scene of the Noli Me Tangere. And placed side by side, the double pilgrimage and the Noli Me Tangere offer to pilgrims and friars in San Francesco and Assisi typological Magdalens who embodied a spiritual transition over time and space. They reinforced the status of the Provençal legend, but also made a visual connection between two important pilgrimage churches, San Francesco in Assisi and Saint Maximin in Provence. Now, the respective cycles of both Tuscan artworks visually codify the transfer of the Magdalene cult to Provence in 1279 and the invention of her relics. They also operate as an important framework in which to situate the Carema altarpiece. This latter work in turn helps us to understand how artworks and their sites functioned as preparation, remembrance, or indeed substitution of the original shrine in wider communities of devotion. Carema was on a branch of the Via Francigena and within reach of Provence via the maritime Alps. Its altarpiece depicting the life of Mary Magdalene engaged with the fame of the Roman tombs by way of its structural form, a decade or so after the translation of the relics. It thus functions as a marker of pilgrimage activity that connects with other shrines. More pointedly, it was contemporary reference to the authenticating authority of the early Christian sarcophagi in Saint Maximin. Years of wear and tear from pilgrims' touch have left the Magdalene tomb and the crypt of Saint Maximin in a desultory condition, whereas the other three retain greater integrity and clarity. Nevertheless, all four would have offered formal and stylistic guidance to the Europa workshop and/or his patron in order to forge a material connection. We can observe the shared horizontal format, the propensity for regular compartments through intercolumniation, and the linear distribution of individual figures that keeps them flush to the surface. There is equally a relationship of scale, with the altarpiece measuring just over 200 centimeters in length and 150 centimeters in height, akin to those of the tombs. The figures in all five objects share a basic rendering in form and gesture to ensure legibility, but also a care in articulating folds and fabrics and the details that enliven their respective scenes. In this case, from crockery and paraliturgical equipment on the altarpiece to trees, birds, and animals on the tomb. Horizontal retibles were common in churches in the Alps during the late 13th century, and so the gabled structure of the Carema altarpiece would be seen as progressive. Its gables find comparison with the Madonna tabernacles that were a speciality in the Aosta Valley and Piedmont, but also anticipates more extravagant altarpiece forms in the 14th century by the Europa master and other workshops. Gables, of course, gave emphasis to the most important religious icons, Christ, the Virgin Mary, or dedicatory saint. But in Carema, there is a substantial difference. The three gables preside over a narrative sequence, calling out three fundamental moments: mountain wilderness, last communion, and death, that divine ascendancy, all of which correspond to the pilgrim's progress in Provence, namely the mountain grotto, the altar, and the relics. In this case, it is, in that sense, a simulation of the original site. This brings us back to the structural form of the tombs and the crypt at St. Maximin and the impression they must have made on visitors. Now, any suggestion for a connection between distanced cult objects in both time and space depends upon the accessibility of the originating site, the agency of the viewer, be it pilgrim, artist, or patron, then the mode of information transmission and interpretation. We know that pilgrims had been visiting the Magdalene Grotto in Provence since the 12th century, most famously Raimondo of Piacenza in the 1170s. And so it is likely that on discovery of the Hypogeum by 1279, the tombs were quickly made accessible to ensure word spread throughout Christendom. Substantial indulgences were granted for Mary Magdalene's feast day of the 22nd July and the relic translation day of the 5th of May. We might also factor in, for the Carema altarpiece in the late 13th century, it is plausible that the Europa master travelled to St. Maximin, demonstrating receptivity to an object's reputation. His commission was to replicate or perform the charge of the object, their essence, in aesthetic, formal, or iconographic terms. Now, caution must always be exercised when using any deductive approach, but by using exemplars as evidence, we can hypothesize about the use of form as a vehicle for the transmission of some essence of the original. We might also factor in local stimuli. The Europamaster was operating in a region with strong Roman history and a landscape littered with the archaeological remains of the past. From triumphal arches to fragmentary stelae, the visual language and grammar of Roman art was familiar and compelling. Tombs were markers of a distinct funerary culture, and they found fresh purchase and form in medieval Christianity and the veneration of saintly relics. The Europamaster evidently looked through those stone containers, but he would have also been familiar with the smaller metal medieval reliquaries that shared similar form. Reliquary chasses were imported from Limoges, the main centre of production down the Via Francigena, to the cathedrals of Aosta and Vercelli during the medieval period, and prove influential for the production of the Europamaster. A comparison of these luxury objects with the altarpiece reveals a clear emulation of precious materials and microarchitecture, equally of compositional layout, narrative flow, and symbolic significance. There is a shared horizontal format spread over two registers, the gabled roof and the flat surfaces. Crucially, both place emphasis on the materiality of devotion. A reliquary chasse is a container of saintly remains, and its structure mimics that of large-scale sarcophagi, reinforcing the family resemblance for the Carema altarpiece. With its wing panels closing over the main visual field, which is populated by figures who play out the life and death of Mary Magdalene in an insistently corporeal way, I would argue that the altarpiece occupies a middle ground between tomb and chasse. It is thus a participant in a dialogue of formal and material reciprocity with the charged relics in Provence. So to wrap up, Carema did not preserve the body of the saint, and there is no surviving evidence to suggest possession of a good relic, since we don't know exactly where it came from in this area. Mary Magdalene already had a presence in the valley, with an altar dedicated to the saint in 1291 in the Cathedral of Aosta. With this in mind, and given the Europamaster's ability to emulate and render international form and opulent materials in carved wood, it seems likely that he was tasked with crafting an altarpiece in Carema that served to point to the precious relics in Provence. In turn, the artwork was recorded meaning through its form, and specifically its reformulation of the charged objects in the crypt of St. Maximin. The Carema altarpiece was clearly designed for visibility on account of its form and large scale. Most likely, it was for a high altar. The patron, be it individual or collective, capitalized on the Europamaster's growing reputation based on his instrumental role in crafting the new pilgrimage shrine in Biella. It was a real opportunity to leverage this success by creating a visual connection with the Magdalene cultic site in Provence that would resonate with the local population and appeal to passing pilgrims. With the papal approbation of 3 April 1295, it was perfect timing to commission an altarpiece, setting out and celebrating the saint's new locale. In this way, it truly is a meeting of image, faith, and place. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joanne, for this fantastic presentation. Thank you. I really like, the analogy that you made between the, the physical ascent that the devotees made, and going to the church and being able to relate to the artworks and really to the ascent that Magdalene is part of the Magdalene story, from sinner to redeemed to saint eventually. Somebody, a saint they could really relate to. And also the analogy with their life, because they lived on the mountain and they climbed up those mountains in their everyday living, for trading, for work, for engaging with other communities. And you put it through very, very well also in your book. So before I give space to the other people in the audience and let them to ask their questions, I would like to know how peculiar it is, this wooden altarpiece. You have many examples of fresco cycles, as you have mentioned at the beginning. So was it really something extraordinary, or did you find other examples maybe in other parts of Central Europe that you can refer?
Of
Yes.
altarpieces with Mary Magdalene's iconography in this sculpted way. Yeah, I mean, this is the earliest one that that we have, and in such complete form, and it's such a glorious object that, you know, it's now in this museum and collection, and so. In terms of that local area, there's every chance that there might be more, but I would doubt it. I think it occupies a very strong place and makes its connections with Provence rather effectively. Though, of course, there's always the survival rate, as we know, with these objects, that records would suggest that we have lost a lot. But in terms of other altarpieces, yes. In chapter 5 of my book, in terms of the mining the Magdalen, there in that particular example, I was looking at the way that the miners in the Riednav Valley decided not to put their devotions towards Saint Barbara, who's normally the patron saint of miners, and normally she protects against lightning and therefore explosions in the mines. And instead they went for Mary Magdalene, and they have these absolutely amazing altarpieces. Would you want to see them? I've got them right at the end of my
If you have
PowerPoint.
the pictures, it would be amazing. Thank you.
It would be nice to have a look at them. If I pop it up again. Oh, no, maybe this one. Yeah, here we go. So if I have a quick. There we go. There's a few more. Here we go.
Yes.
You know, like they're from the late 15th and early 16th century. So we're seeing a real shift in terms of structures, because before you're seeing, you know, a winged retable, which is minus its wings now, they've been lost. But in this case here, you've got again examples of winged altarpieces from more the northern traditions. And in this case, we've moved over to the central eastern side of the Alps, to the Tyrol. And on the left-hand side, you've got the altarpiece by Hans Harder. It's the first altarpiece that was commissioned for this church. And as you can see, it's got the central sculpture there of a rather exotic-looking Mary Magdalene there, with her alabaster vase being rather elegantly presented. And she's got this beautiful headdress, but surrounding her are painted scenes, and they're painted on the reverse of the wings as well when it's shut, from scenes from her life, quite familiar ones. You can see here that she's listening to the preaching of Christ. There's the Noli Me Tangere. She's got prostrate at the feet of Christ in the house of the Pharisee, and then her elevation by angels in the wilderness again. So these common images that make her very universal. Yes. Now, miners really get into the cult of the Magdalene, and they decide to commission a new altarpiece, something much grander, from Matthias Stoebel, who's a local artist, very prestigious artist from Sterzing. And he produces something much more extravagant here, where there's actually a greater sense of the materiality of the object as linked to mining. And just in this detail, if you can look in the central corpus of the altarpiece, and you can see there that the Magdalene's in her kind of hirsute form, with her hairy one suit, and her hair is gilded, so she's very gold looking. But below her feet, there's a mountain, and if you look very closely, you can just see this little figure mining, and there's a cave underneath. There's two little figures, and it's actually representing the miners and their activities. So they locate themselves into the imagery of Mary Magdalene. And there's something really interesting going on here, with the use of sculpture, with a carved altarpiece, and the idea that it's a very material iconography, that the miners actually see almost being protected by the saint hovering over the landscape in which they work. And that actually, in order to profess their devotions, they're mining into that sacred landscape that's below her feet. And it's a really interesting discourse going on in the object between these material qualities, this great emphasis on gold and the riches that the miners are going to excavate from the mountain, and how this is evoked on the surfaces of the altarpiece. And just really interestingly, I mean, it's a very challenging and risky business doing mining in this period, It was often with very difficult working conditions, but also with massive amounts of wealth potential. And these miners were particularly renowned for having silver spikes in their boots for ascending the mountains. So, but they decided that Mary Magdalene was a particularly effective protectress and intercessor for them. And so these two altarpieces are just real highlights in terms of what can be done in terms of the Magdalene cult in the Alps. There are other sculpted altarpieces, but I think that these ones are particularly fascinating to look at.
Amazing, amazing pieces. And, you know, it just shows how the image here requires the same, almost the same value as a reliquary. You know, almost the same power, you know, where they didn't have the relic, the image kind of substituted the relic and became the object of this incredible devotion.
Exactly, and I think, you know, like for all of us who've maybe looked at these kind of altarpieces before, it's if not, it's understanding that there are kind of layers of access to this, the divine quality of them, the kind of the sacred subjects that they're depicting. So there's a reason why the exteriors of the wings and the internal wings are painted rather than being sculpted, because there's a level of when it's closed on non-feast days, that you're seeing the narratives, but it's in a slightly less resplendent way. So when the doors, the wings are opened up, you get this sense of getting more proximate to the sacred because of the use of the gilding and the intricacy of the tracery here that really makes it glow. And one has to imagine it under very particular lighting conditions. Also, you're seeing it in broad sunlight here. It's beautifully illuminated for us, but with candlelight it would have shimmered and looked rather spectacular. So there's shutters to go over the main corpus, but also on the predella below. This encloses as well. So, and just to give you an idea of the scale, that the sacristan who let me into the church, she had to climb on top of the altar and use a metal pole to be able to open and close it. So it's quite tough work for her to do, very delicate work.
I can imagine, I can imagine. So I wanted to ask you another question, and then we can see if anyone else wants to step in. You know, Mary Magdalene, of course, is a much venerated figure, but also a controversial figure. You know, from the Gospels to the Golden Legend to, you know, the novels and the, like, Da Vinci Code and beyond. What is it that still stimulates all this curiosity around her figure?
Yeah, it's always the perennial question of why do we find her so fascinating? And I think that there's just there's an archetypal quality to this figure. She seems to be able to shapeshift across the eras and be made for her own into new times and recontextualized constantly. And I think but yeah, it's I think it's just this interest here about her her closeness to Christ is always extremely fascinating, of why she was privileged in this particular way. And then there's also you know, because she was the Paschal witness to the resurrection, she's given this very privileged role in the Gospel of John. She's very favored in this way, but then she gets attached to a narrative of sin, which is not there in any gospel account of Mary Magdalene. She's a very difficult figure to pin down. But in the 6th century, Gregory the Great puts a composite figure together and attaches this unnamed sinner in the Gospel of Luke. And this becomes the model going forward for a model of redemption. So she becomes the fallen woman, this kind of second Eve. And I think this narrative of a fallen woman coming good and being able to be redeemed despite whatever sins she's accused of, that she too is forgiven by Christ and therefore is allowed to take her place as a saint, you know. And it's that kind of redemption story that proves so compelling, you know, through the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance. But then, of course, once one comes up into the more modern times, it starts to become intertwined with feminist discourse on, like, why has this happened? Why, you know, was this act taken to malign a woman who clearly had absolutely no taint of sin attached to her? why does, is this an act of misogyny? Is it, was it just pure convenience? Did they need some sort of positive message, like at Easter time, in that Easter homily, to say that, like, follow this woman, like she was close to Christ, and now if you follow her, even she was redeemed, you can be redeemed. So she becomes this great exemplar. But the character assassination that basically happens is then something that becomes so fascinating for feminist scholars and for us today working on her. And this is why you can approach her from so many different angles. But despite the Catholic Church actually separating up her gospel and her apocryphal identities, and saying that she's not this, cannot be identified with Luke's unnamed sinner, and we need to separate this, and it's been since the 60s, we're still jumping to the connection. And even if you look at the most popular presentations of her since in popular culture, something like Lady Gaga's Judas and this music video, a rather frenetic performance of this redemption narrative, is that the bad girl seems to still get all the attention. And this also then has to be placed against the recent film with Runa Mary, for trying to present a much more authentic presentation of the Magdalene as the companion of Christ and someone who he listened to for learned advice. And of course, that one there was accused of being too sober and too restrained. So I think there's a fascination in all the color that Mary Magdalene brings, as much as that kind of great exemplar of faith and proximity to Christ. So she's a very complex character, and a colleague of mine has called her a mosaic of different pieces to be put together, and I think that's such an apt way of discussing her. And there are so many analogies of ways to discuss her, and I think that's why we're still discussing her today, including myself.
That's very true. Alana, I think you can speak now. Would you like to ask a question?
Yes, I was wondering, it's actually kind of amazing that one of the sort of key altarpieces that came up as an example on the side, the altarpiece by the Master of the Magdalen, is exactly the reason why I came in to see this talk. And although it's sort of a side issue, I was wondering if in the book you have been looking at all at the provenance of this work, which I understand is from the Servite Church of the Santissimo Nunziata in Florence, because I'm actually very interested in the context, which I haven't come across much so far in the past, but the context in which it might have actually been used in the church. And I was wondering if you have actually had a chance to delve into that all.
Well, the short answer is no, because actually there's not a lot of information about this altarpiece. I've known of fellow colleagues who have been trying to dig into it more, but it's one of these still altarpieces that hasn't quite revealed its full history yet. We've managed, it's placed within the Servite Church, but exactly what it's doing remains to be seen, really. And there's a number of hypotheses that have been put forward by scholars in the past, and I would be very happy to pass on any references if they would be helpful to you.
Fantastic, yes.
But the work has been more of an orientation point for me, because a lot of ink has been built on the Tuscan cult of Mary Magdalene.
Evidence of that cult is a bit later.
So it is a work that tends to be discussed within narratives of Mary Magdalene in Italy and in the Tuscan traditions. So my hope was to try and orientate the Carema altarpiece to try and see it as part of a larger movement of interest in Mary Magdalene at this time, and to offer a point of comparison to show how it shares particular imagery at this time, and what goes as universal imagery, and then where it goes localized. So, but I'm very happy to pass on. Perhaps I can do that with Sandra to get some references to you to find out more.
Of course, a lot of people who are interested.
It's a great work, and it's absolutely superb, and it's, you know, it's such an important one. I mean, a lot of the scholarship is from quite a few decades ago now, so it's you know, I think we're actually waiting for a new work to see, like, if anybody has managed to dig out of the archives any further information that would give some insight, because it seems too important to not have its story told. But then this is the issue with many artworks, including my own, is that we have
Oh,
enormous
that's right.
gaps.
You're absolutely right. I was looking today just at the Palazzo Madama website, and you should write them, because you know their information about your altarpiece are not very up to date. So yes, you know, this
Well, they were very gracious in letting me use it as my front cover. So I was absolutely delighted, particularly like when Bloomsbury actually managed to do a detail that kind of evoked the Alps and the peaks.
yes.
So I felt like it was, even though I talk an awful lot about fresco painting in my book, this work is actually just so beautiful to look at, and just really quite a stunning start to the narrative that takes one across the Alps, that it seemed the right thing to put on the front cover. This is also a thing, you know, like when you're dealing with the lacunae in history and how one brings narratives to the forth, and when, you know, you don't necessarily have text to rely on, as in documentary text, it becomes a bit of a challenge. This is also a question of conservation, and particularly, you know, like we've looked at tonight, an object that's of museum quality and of local significance, and really because of its age. But equally, the Magdalen master panel is part of that narrative, that, you know, it's a superbly conserved work, whereas in comparison to many of the things that I have to discuss in my book, it's a bit of detective work, as you know, Sandra has to do as well in the work, and others will have to do too, is to take heart in the fact that one is having to fill in the gaps and work in quite difficult conditions in order to gain access and photograph and piece the evidence together to make a sensible account of what you're seeing.
Oh, absolutely. It's, you know, it's a pleasure. You're delving into areas and problems that are new to the majority, but of course it's also a big challenge. So
yeah, and I've seen it's quite a long time ago since I was trooping across the Alps. I mean, it's one of the great things when you take on a research project, is that you have to think about where you actually want to end up studying and spending a lot of time. And then I fast realized, once I was heading further north rather than just northern Italy and into the mountains, that I was actually going to have to go hiking in there and endure quite beautiful conditions, but also some very harsh conditions. I still remember with my fingers just feeling like they were going to drop off when I was working in the Maritime Alps in January in the worst snowstorm that Italy's ever seen at that time. And it was so freezing. I had mountaineering heat pads just to try and keep my hands steady while I was trying to photograph, with hopefully the shutter not freezing up. So it's just, but you kind of feel proud. You're almost like doing a pilgrimage to these sites yourself.
Yes.
And I think that's the thing that I've tried to weave through this book, is the experiential aspect of these artworks and their sites, what we were just talking about at the beginning, but also how the impact it has actually on the scholar who's trying to do the work, or the researcher, because you too have to lug yourself up the mountain with all your kit to arrive at the paintings in a particular way that's been organized by the people that designed it. And
that's right. That's right.
And I think that has an impact on the way that we understand things, and to try and suggest that we can be completely objective to these things and not include our subjectivity. You know, to say that how I felt walking up that mountain isn't part of it would be to neglect the part of the historical significance of these works. So that's quite an exciting kind of thing that I found out during this research and as I go on with my research.
Well, of course, and this leads into this last question, let's say, from Laura Morrison, and it says, thank you. Who would have guessed such treasures were within these little churches in the Alps? Probably you didn't expect that either when you started. No,
it's you only see it like snippets in books, and you know they're part of little surveys and local production, or they're just details of pictures, and they've taken maybe the best snapshot that they've got of a particular scene from a fresco cycle, and then you arrive in the church, and some of them just about, you know, knocked me back. You know, they were overwhelming. When I was working, say, in this tiny village Cusiano in Trentino, the time I'd bust my way up there. And I had to stay over a couple of nights there, and it was just a strange place to be in, like on your own. But I walked into the church, and it was one of the most immersive experiences of just so much imagery, so colorful, and these narratives just whirling around you. And you're thinking, my goodness, you know, like what an experience this would have been when they were painted, and for the local parishioners. And I think, you know, that's such a thing that everyone can relate to when you think about maybe walking into your own church in your local area and imagining it was blanketed in images of the saint who it's dedicated to, and then thinking, now what difference does that make when I'm sitting in here praying or just having some quiet contemplation time? And this was equally so in Bergamo when I was working on workshops who transmitted iconographies, imageries over from Bergamo into Trentino, into the church in Cusiano. And in the lower in the lower city of Bergamo, there's a Magdalen flagellants church there. It's now a deconsecrated space and it's used for exhibitions, but the upper surfaces of the fresco paintings have been removed and put into their museum in the upper city, but the lower versions of the frescoes, this is always interesting, you can separate them up and leave layers like an onion. So the lower levels are still left in many parts inside this deconsecrated church. And in amongst all the other works, it's just an absolute temple to Mary Magdalene. And I've never seen so many images of that hirsute saint repeated and repeated and repeated and repeated, you know, in different eras. So you're layering it up in almost this kind of archaeology of these churches. So it's whether it's in the valley floors or it's down in the pre-Alps in the cities, there's this way of networking all of these things. So it's a real privilege to work on it, and it's a delight to bring it to more people's attention. So if you are going on holiday eventually when we're all released from the plague, that you might be able to make your way to see some of these riches. I can certainly recommend going to a place like Bolzano in Alto Adige in South Tyrol, and to see the riches of the fresco paintings there. It's another important site in my book that I discussed, the Magdalen, and it's a wonderful place to go and visit. So.
Well, thank you very much again, Joanne, for a wonderful, wonderful presentation. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you all for coming.
You are very welcome, and we are looking forward to engaging with you and your department again soon. I would just like, before I close and say goodbye, to remind everyone of our next appointment, which will be on Thursday, 26th of November, and that will be Dr. Sandra Toffolo, who is a fellow at the Harvard Center for Italian Renaissance Studies at Villa Itati in Florence, and she will present on the way to the Holy Land, Venice as a point of embarkation for foreign pilgrims in the Renaissance. So it will be on Thursday, 26th of November at 7:30 again. And then we are trying to put together a surprise Christmas event for Thursday, 3rd of December at 7:30 again. And this will be from Italy, but this is a secret still. So watch this space again, watch our website at aberdeenitaliancircle.org, aberdeenitaliancircle.org, or follow us on Facebook. Thank you very much, Joanne. Thank you, David. Thank you, everyone. And see you very soon. Good night. Buonanotte, grazie.